The eMac. What a strange computer. It was released in 2002 as, it must be said, a cheap alternative to the iMac, which had just started sporting a faster processor, a shiny new flat panel display, distinctive new design, and nearly double the price tag. Ordinarily, most of these would be good things for Apple's loyal customers, except for one big demographic, schools, who had some concerns. If nothing else, school computers need to be two things: cheap enough to buy hundreds of on a usually shoestring budget, and able to withstand the ultimate punishment: the idle hands of devilish school children, neither of which applied to the new iMac and its delicate new neck. Apple, at that point still the underdog of the PC industry, capitulated and ended up consulting with schools to try directly addressing their needs. The result was this, the eMac, short for Education Mac. Right off the bat, I suspect this was the kind of product Steve Jobs hated. The eMac was a utilitarian machine, built to satisfy a specific need and budget. But Jobs' passion was for universally accessible, perfectly crafted appliances, a jewel that sat on your desk and expanded your mind's capabilities. He certainly wasn't about making cheap alternatives to anything. But he did have a soft spot for education going all the way back to the Apple II, and education did account for as much as a quarter of Apple's sales at this point. So my guess is this one time, he let it slide. Still, unlike the usual fanfare accompanying an Apple product launch, the eMac's release was incredibly unceremonious. At first, it wasn't even publicly available. If we weren't a school looking for a bulk supply of Macs, Apple didn't even want us thinking about it. We did though, and due to, quote, strong customer demand, probably just for the cheapest Mac on the market at the time, Apple did eventually make it available to regular consumers too. I imagine them kind of shrugging their shoulders like, really? You want this thing? Well, I guess we're already making them. And so the eMac slid into the entry-level position. The choice for anyone who just wanted the cheapest Mac they could buy. In many ways, it was just a slight evolution to the previous iMac. They put in a newer, faster CPU, a bigger CRT with a flat front, which was all the rage back then, and then forgot to include any of the cuteness. Okay, I know that's subjective, beauty is an eye of the beholder, and other such lies, but you gotta admit this is not one of Johnny Ive's finest. It's also heavy and slippery, always a winning combination, and it has a fan that drones on like the audio equivalent of a dull toothache. To be fair, the sheer bulkiness was in fact a feature. It made it more rugged in the face of certain doom, but it's not surprising that for many the eMac is one of the more forgettable Macs of this era. So why talk about the eMac at all? Well, it is historically significant. Despite their reluctance, it was for a time a major piece of Apple's product lineup. It was also the last CRT Apple ever produced. It's not a Trinitron, a little disappointing. Apple had dabbled in supplying Sony tubes in their monitors throughout the 90s and early 2000s, but like I said, this was built for a budget. And despite spending the last 2 minutes completely shitting all over it, I actually do kinda like the eMac. Ignoring its appearance, it is a solid computer with pretty good performance for the time. And it's kind of charming in its ugliness. Maybe you could call it unconventionally attractive. Plus, this one specifically has a pretty interesting story behind it. I found it on Craigslist for the low price of $40. I didn't save a copy of the listing, but I remember the very specific wording that it had been left outside but protected from the elements. To be honest, I have no idea what that means. It could be anything from it was left in a shed to it sat on the porch with a tarp on top. All I know is when I arrived to pick it up, it was sitting in a wheelbarrow. But it did power on, so I wheeled it to my car, figuring I could probably do something interesting with it. I ended up giving it a proper test on stream. Something I always like to do is a little digital archaeology. What was the most recently modified file in the system? That gives us a good estimate of the last time it was powered on. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately for the previous owner, they had the good sense to wipe the eMac with a clean install of OS X Leopard, the last OS to support these old PowerPC Macs. The most recently modified file was sometime in 2008, but I'm not sure if that's because that was the last time it was used, or because that's around the time most files in Leopard would be dated. Honestly, Leopard is a bit much for something like this. It's like trying to run Windows Vista on an early Pentium 4. Still, my chat and I tried a bunch of things to see just how far we could push it. We quickly discovered it was the first revision of the eMac, making it also one of the last computers that could natively boot into creaky old OS 9. But this also meant it was the slowest of the eMacs, clocking it in a paltry 700 MHz, which was evident in just about everything we tried. Just getting games onto it was a challenge. It was too old to have even USB 2, so I was stuck with the 12 megabit per second USB 1.1 or the eMac CD drive. Yeah, CD, it can't even read DVDs. Surprisingly, USB was still about twice as fast as the CD drive, though that might be partly due to the drive's age. Halo was acceptable. eMac falls just barely within its minimum system requirements, though kind of fascinatingly on paper this eMac specs are not that different to an original Xbox. Its GPU is a little worse, but everything else is, if anything, slightly better. This was not reflected in the gameplay though. I guess the disparity in GPU makes a difference, and I guess the eMac is running a whole ass operating system in the background. Also, who knows how well they optimized this for PowerPC. Of course, I'm scrutinizing this today, but as kids, we all played games that ran this well or worse on the family PC, so overall, not bad. Unfortunately, by this point, Apple was already well into their "we don't care about games" arc, and the pickings were few and far between. But there have been some really interesting community ports made from recent decompilations. Friend of the channel Wham! Wham! Ported Sonic Mania and Super Mario 64. Sonic Mania had a pretty good showing. There were some slow points, especially the software-rendered 3D bonus stages, but all in all, it was good enough that, once again, we all agreed we would have happily played through it if we were kids. The Mario 64 decomp was a little tougher. The port ran okay at times, but pretty poorly at other times. It depended a lot on how much was being rendered. With some settings tweaks, we could get the castle to render pretty well, but it would consistently fall apart as soon as we entered Bob-omb Battlefield. Still, running it natively like this was way better than actually trying to emulate Mario 64. 64's, basically the only N64 emulator for PowerPC Macs, struggled to render even 1 frame per second. It was more like seconds per frame, even with some tweaks provided by the community. Oh god, look at this performance. Finally, we had to try Minecraft. I was kind of surprised there even was a Minecraft for this, but supporting Java 5, which it did until 2013, meant it still worked on Leopard, even for PowerPC. It wasn't great. It was better than emulating the N64, but that's not saying much. It was kind of surprising to see it work at all, but this fell well below the threshold of playable if we were kids.
And we got some Minecraft. Oh yeah, 3 FPS. 4 glorious FPS.
Sadly, in general, ports to PowerPC Mac are rare. Not just because they're an incredibly nerdy platform to feel nostalgia for, but also because of one big problem. Specifically, a big endian problem. Endianness is really a topic for another video, but to sum it up, it's all about how the CPU accesses numbers in memory. Some architectures access memory in the order that us meatbags read it, with the most significant digits first, but a lot of others, including probably the CPU you're using right now, access it in reverse, with the least significant bytes first. There are pros and cons to both approaches, and technically PowerPC CPUs can switch between them, but in practice this is complicated, and most PowerPC code is compiled for its default big endianness. In the end, for better or for worse, a little endian won out. Unless a developer specifically wrote with both targets in mind, chances are high they made some assumptions that only work on little endian. This means to port anything to PowerPC, you have to painstakingly comb through the code for any time it reads numbers from a file or a memory buffer, because anything that was stored in a way that only a little endian CPU would interpret correctly will now be backwards, wreaking havoc on the code. So you go through all that effort just to get it to run, only to discover that on this old-ass hardware, it runs like shit. So really, that was the eMac. A kind of interesting piece of history and probably a decent system for older, like OS 9 games, but its uses today are limited. But despite the yellowing and apparently an inability to wake from sleep, this one seems to work perfectly fine.
It won't turn on anymore.
Is this a thing where the eMac struggles to wake from sleep?
Sometimes you gotta live life on the edge.
See, it's still fine. We gotta take a look inside though. I feel like this can only go one of two ways. Either it's gonna be shockingly spotless for something that was outside for an extended period of time, or it's gonna be packed full of cockroaches, dirt, and corrosion, and it'll be a wonder how it even runs at all. Only one way to find out. Unlike the iMac G3, which I've opened many of over the years, this is actually the first time I've ever opened an eMac. Right off the bat, this thing forced me to buy new screwdrivers because it's held together with 2.5mm hex screws. I had a collection of Allen keys from various pieces of furniture over the years, but unfortunately they were all too big, except for this one that was way too small. Likewise, my Torx screwdrivers didn't seem to be doing much either. I can only assume they use these for aesthetic reasons. I mean, there are also some regular Phillips screws on here, but only on the bottom where you can't see them. I could take those out, but for the rest I'd have to wait. But I have to say these look awfully like screws that have been tampered with before. In fact, it was a struggle to remove them without stripping them further, but they did eventually come loose. I don't know what that suggests about the state of this thing. Upon closer inspection, one of the hex screws is actually missing entirely. I have no idea what happened there. Anyway, I finally got the screwdriver and god damn these things were stuck good. I don't know if it's rust or if this is just how these things usually are, but I was honestly really concerned I'd strip them. I mean, they're already pretty damn circular. But no, with the help of a more frictiony glove, it still wasn't easy. But I did manage to get them all out without incident. There's a gotcha when taking apart eMacs that I actually was aware of. The power button is part of the outer case with a delicate wire connecting it to the main board that could snap if you don't disconnect it before yanking the case off. This gave me my first encounter with the insides of the case, and you know what? It wasn't great. I can definitely believe this thing was left outside for a while. There are cobwebs all over the place and several pockets of dirt. That being said, it's actually not quite as bad as I thought it might be. There's a little corrosion, but nothing too crazy. The board itself looks pristine. There's a little debris here and there, but that probably just dislodged from me taking it apart. Obviously, it'd be nice to give this thing a good clean and restoration, but this will probably require a fairly comprehensive disassembly to get every component thoroughly cleaned. And I figure if I'm gonna pull it all apart, maybe I could do something else with it too. Right now, on my Patreon and YouTube members pages, there's a poll where you can vote for what I should do with this eMac. Should I try to restore it to showroom condition? Should I try overclocking it or making it silent? Should I try replacing the internals with a Hackintosh or ARM Mac Mini? I don't want to replace the CRT, even though it would make it lighter, give me more room inside, and doesn't look half bad since the front is already flat, but the CRT is just a part of the eMac aesthetic for me. I can't really see myself ever wanting to get rid of it. Plus, in this day and age, we may as well hold on to whatever CRTs we can. But it is possible to hijack the VGA signal and send whatever we want to it. I could even just make it a VGA monitor and maybe have a switch so it could still be an eMac when I wanted it to be. Imagine using this as a monitor for an old 98 or XP machine. That'd be pretty cursed. So if you want to vote and follow along how it all goes, check out the links in the description. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.